Dark psychology refers to the systematic use of psychological manipulation to influence, control, or dominate another person's thoughts, emotions, or behavior without their informed consent. It is not persuasion. It is not healthy influence. It is the exploitation of cognitive vulnerabilities for personal gain. Manipulators do not rely on physical force. They rely on predictability in the human mind. This presentation explains how psychological manipulators gain control, the cognitive mechanisms they exploit, and why victims often remain unaware while the manipulation is occurring. All material presented here is drawn from behavioral psychology, trauma research, coercive control studies, and documented case analyses. Section 1. The core mechanism. Human cognition relies heavily on heuristics and predictive shortcuts, which allow the brain to process complex information efficiently. These include pattern recognition, trust-based inference, and effective heuristics enabling rapid decisions without conscious deliberation. Manipulative behavior exploits these mechanisms by redirecting existing neural pathways and perceptual frameworks rather than creating entirely new thoughts. Control is exerted through the alteration of the victim's perception, which automatically biases decision-making and behavior. Neurologically, when perception is modified, prefrontal limbic circuits adjust responses accordingly, producing actions that feel self-generated to the individual. This illusion of agency, maintained by the brain's reliance on heuristics, is essential to the manipulator's success, as it allows behavioral control without explicit commands or conscious compliance. Section 2. Psychological vulnerabilities. Manipulation is effective because all humans exhibit predictable cognitive and emotional susceptibilities. These include the need for social approval, fear of social rejection, requirement for emotional security, intolerance of uncertainty, trust in perceived consistency, and the drive to seek meaning and validation. Manipulators do not create these vulnerabilities, they detect and exploit them. Through careful observation, a specific susceptibility becomes a leverage point, allowing the manipulator to influence perception and behavior without overt coercion. Neurocognitively, these vulnerabilities correspond to activity in prefrontal and limbic circuits, where emotional salience and social cognition guide decision-making and judgment. Section 3. Control through emotional conditioning. A highly effective mechanism of manipulation is emotional conditioning, in which the manipulator alternates between reinforcement and withdrawal. Positive reinforcement can include approval, attention, validation, or affection, while negative reinforcement may manifest as criticism, emotional coldness, silence, or induced confusion. This intermittent reinforcement schedule enhances attachment as the victim becomes cognitively and emotionally focused on restoring the positive state. From a behavioral psychology perspective, this mirrors classical operant conditioning, where the brain associates compliance with reduction of aversive stimuli. Neurobiologically, these cycles engage reward pathways in the ventral striatum and stress response circuits in the amygdala, reinforcing behavioral patterns without conscious awareness. The result is a subtle but powerful influence over perception, decision-making, and emotional regulation. Section 4. Gaslighting and reality distortion. Gaslighting is a core mechanism of psychological manipulation involving the systematic destabilization of a person's cognitive confidence. The manipulator repeatedly challenges the victim's memory accuracy, perceptual validity, and judgment, creating internal doubt. Common strategies include denial of verifiable events, reframing harmful behavior as misinterpretation, pathologizing emotional responses as oversensitivity, altering past narratives, and asserting false versions of reality with high confidence. Over time, this process degrades metacognitive trust, impairing the victim's ability to evaluate their own thoughts and experiences. As self-trust erodes, the victim increasingly relies on the manipulator as an external reference point for reality, consolidating psychological control without overt force. Section 5. Identity Erosion. Prolonged exposure to psychological manipulation results in progressive erosion of personal identity. Victims often exhibit diminished confidence in decision-making, reduced emotional autonomy, and an increasing dependence on external validation to regulate self-worth. Over time, individuals may experience impaired access to personal needs, preferences, and internal cues, accompanied by a growing fear of independent action. This process is gradual rather than abrupt. Each behavioral or emotional concession appears minor in isolation. However, the cumulative neuropsychological impact produces significant dependency, in which the individual's sense of self becomes increasingly contingent on the manipulator's feedback and approval. Section 6. Neurological and stress responses. Chronic psychological manipulation produces sustained activation of the hypothalamic-pituitary-adrenal axis, resulting in persistently elevated glucocorticoid levels, particularly cortisol. Neuroimaging and clinical studies associate prolonged stress exposure with hyperreactivity of the amygdala, increasing threat detection, hypervigilance, and fear conditioning. Simultaneously, there is functional downregulation of the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, impairing executive function, inhibitory control, and decision-making capacity. Under these conditions, neural resources are preferentially allocated toward threat appraisal and survival-oriented processing, rather than reflective analysis or long-term planning. Resistance becomes neurologically compromised, not due to character weakness but due to stress-induced dysregulation of cognitive control systems. The individual's nervous system is operating in a state of allostatic overload. Section 7. Control through isolation. Psychological manipulation frequently involves systematic social isolation, in which access to external reference points for reality testing is progressively reduced. This process may include relationship sabotage, induced distrust toward family or peers, and the deliberate positioning of the manipulator as the sole credible authority or source of safety. External individuals are often reframed as misinformed, threatening, or emotionally unsafe, discouraging independent verification of experiences. The resulting isolation impairs cognitive cross-validation, limiting the victim's ability to compare perceptions against alternative perspectives. As social input narrows, dependence on the manipulator's interpretations intensifies, expanding psychological control while reducing detection of distortion. Section 8. The illusion of choice. Manipulators rarely give direct orders. Instead, they limit options in subtle ways. Choices are framed so that only one option avoids conflict, punishment, or emotional loss. Sometimes compliance is presented as the victim's own idea. Other times, false choices are created where every option leads to the same outcome. The victim feels in control even while their behavior is being guided. This sense of choice prevents resistance because people are far less likely to question situations where they believe they are acting freely. Section 9. Victim psychology. Victims of manipulation often rationalize what is happening to them. Common responses include self-blame, downplaying the harm, defending the manipulator's behavior, and believing that compliance will restore stability or peace. These reactions are not signs of weakness. They are coping mechanisms the mind uses to reduce internal conflict and emotional distress. Over time, the brain begins to associate familiarity with safety. As a result, leaving the situation can feel more dangerous than staying, even when harm is ongoing. Section 10: Clinical Recognition and Recovery. Recovery from psychological manipulation begins with recognition, not confrontation. Clinical approaches focus on understanding manipulation patterns, rebuilding trust in personal perception, and restoring emotional boundaries that were gradually eroded. Treatment often includes the careful reintroduction of external support systems and trauma-informed therapy to address stress-related responses. Recovery is not immediate. The nervous system requires time to return to baseline functioning after prolonged threat. Reclaiming autonomy involves reestablishing internal authority, where decisions are guided by self-trust rather than external control. Section 11: Final Summary. Psychological manipulation functions by exploiting predictable features of human cognition and emotional regulation. It alters perception, conditions emotional responses, and gradually weakens self-trust. Victims are not controlled due to lack of intelligence or strength. Control occurs because the brain prioritizes safety, attachment, and stability when under prolonged stress. Once these mechanisms are understood, manipulation loses its sense of mystery. It becomes visible as systematic exploitation, not power or superiority. Awareness restores agency, and agency is the foundation of psychological autonomy. You've just heard one more fragment of how unstable, unpredictable, and fragile the human mind really is. If this case or this disorder changed the way you look at people, that means you're finally seeing what most can't see. New files will be opened soon. More cases, more disorders, more cracks in the human psyche. Until then, stay observant. And if you want more cases, you know what to do. Remember, observation is survival.